Let's start on time, and anybody who comes late can always hear the recording, which will be posted on YouTube on the In People channel later today. Ismail, I'm going to let you lead the way because you're such a good host. If you hear somebody typing furiously, whoever that is, just know your mic is on.
I
Okay.
was just typing in the discussion channel, letting everybody know that if the stage is invisible, they can ping me and I can see if I can fix that for them. But it should be visible.
Cool. I'm going to let you lead the way because you're such a good host, Ismail.
Yeah, thank you. That's a lot more
I'm happy to
pressure than
do
I
it.
want.
No, I'm happy to do it if you want, but I think you're better at it.
Well, what I'd like to do is I'd like to actually pass the baton on that stage to you because I think you are the one who asks good questions when it comes to attacking technical problems at the high level. I'm more in the weeds. So
Okay.
what first I'd like to say is that we had a really good discussion last time in part one, which was mostly about history and where this project is coming from. But the important part is where we're going, and in order to get there, we have to show everyone what we've done, which is the present, which is this part two discussion. So Argo is no and Aris, that is just the three of us here. This is going to be recorded. Hopefully, we'll behave ourselves, and the swearing will be kept to a minimum. And I hope that we get somebody to join so they can ask some questions like last time. But if that doesn't happen, we'll just discuss all of the things that we have done so far and where we are, and ask each other questions so that we can clarify among ourselves things that we have misconceptions or questions for. So what I would say is let me have you tell a little bit about a quick summary of how you want to get this done. What is your vision about what we have and whether we can transition straight to what we already have built and whether that works. Ari.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, so I'll give a very quick reiteration of what was in part one, just in a couple sentences. But to remind people, the core concept behind In People from back in 2012 when we started it was to introduce self-governance basically to social media. And the idea was to allow for parallel experimentation around common interests of different governance structures, rules, leadership, etc., so that people essentially can self-fulfill whatever ambitions they have better and more effectively for whatever needs. It could be trivial reasons. It could be to lobby real-world governments and change things in the real world, or it could be much more trivial than that. But it was with that sort of context that we picked up the baton again recently and introduced those concepts into basically the blockchain space. And the reason blockchain makes sense for that is because governance is something that needs to be permissionless. And that's the one killer feature that blockchain brings. You know, we see a lot of people bringing things to the blockchain because it was an easy way to sell something during the mania in the last couple cycles. But here, what we're doing is bringing it to the blockchain because it needs the blockchain, and it needs the blockchain because the blockchain is permissionless. So, for example, why would you need permissionless self-governance? Well, in the US, it may seem unnecessary for the most part, although we've had our trying times and have our own political issues, as everybody knows. But in other countries, in dictatorships and fascist regimes globally, um, you don't have the luxury that Americans take for granted, like free speech, political organization, all those things that we think we have guaranteed here, and for the most part do, especially in comparison to other countries. And so, in such in the rest of the world, so to speak, that suffers from some of those lack of freedoms, that permissionless nature is very important. And it's important not just so that you can organize yourselves within those contexts, but so that you can organize yourself for the purpose of changing those contexts. So you can lobby for change. Things like the Arab Spring, for example, from the 2010s, could be more effectively organized theoretically with tools that were custom built for organization. Um, and so that's the reason we came to the blockchain. Now, as to what we've accomplished on the blockchain already at a very high level, what we've done, and of course, I did none of the technical aspects of this, I have to disclose, but on a conceptual level, what we've done is distill that concept to its absolute minimum with a couple of smart contracts. Smart contracts, of course, are programmable, interactive logic that lives on chain, which grants it that permissionless nature we were just talking about. And what we've started with is an initial smart contract, which allows you to found what we call a virtual country. I'll probably refer to it just as a country going forward on this conversation. But it allows anybody who essentially mints or creates a duplicate of this smart contract on the blockchain to create their own country. And that country initially begins as a simplifying assumption as a dictatorship. That means that the person who founded it, which again could be anybody, gets to control it unilaterally in the beginning. And what they can control specifically is the decision-making process behind that initial smart contract, behind their country. So we just said that that's a dictatorship, but the dictator can decide to transition that to democracy or to representative democracy or to an aristocracy or to whatever custom governance logic they wish. And due to technical details that Isno and Argo will go into later, the smart contract we've currently presented, it presents itself in such a way that it is easy to do so. It is easy to customize and transition the governance logic behind the country. But the other simplifying assumption and introduction conceptually that the smart contract has, which is very interesting, is the idea that you can dynamically, using the same governance logic, add and customize the scope of the country on a going forward basis. So what does that mean? That's a lot of words. But what it means is you can add functionality by adding other sanctioned smart contracts within the boundaries of the country. And so if you want to, let's say, have a smart contract that lends itself to being a communal treasury for the country, well, you can do that. But to do that, you need to check the governance logic. In the beginning, again, that's dictatorial. So in the beginning, the founder of the country can simply append as many smart contracts to a list that resides within the country's smart contract that define the boundaries of that country unilaterally. And later, if it were to say transition to democracy by changing the governance logic, as we previously discussed, then those smart contracts that define the country could be amended through democratic process, so by vote, basically. So that, again, you can add and delete the scope of the country as you need to. So you can add the treasury that we used, for example. You could add, let's say, a marketplace. You could add an election logic smart contract. So if we don't want to do direct democracy for everything, we could institute a new governance module in this fashion. And it could apply to other smart contracts that we've already brought in to the boundaries of our country. So if you have, like I said, the Treasury example again, the Treasury might be dictatorially controlled, even though the country itself is democratic. And if it were to do other things, like let's say there were a marketplace, maybe the marketplace has its own set of elected representatives, which have a control over the marketplace activities. And so each of these different smart contracts and functions that we have brought into the boundaries of our country can then have their own modular governance logic attached to them. And all of these things, the scope, the list of smart contracts, and the governance modules and to what they apply is all dynamic and decided by the community by the rules set through the previous governance decisions made. And what that means, in short, is anybody can start their own contract that has any scope that's relevant to them, and they can customize whatever logic they would like for it to make decisions collectively going forward. And the idea is that that creates a sandbox for people to do whatever they want, to experiment in parallel with one another on what governance structures, what functions, what leadership works best for solving their problems. And that's a major, major advantage to what we have now, which is sort of a stagnant and almost impossible to experiment with set of real world political structures. Now, a natural question that arises when people first hear this idea is, well, that's great, but in the real world, you have armies and land and consequential things to make decisions over on the internet. What is it exactly that you can decide that's enforceable? Which is a very good question. But what I would say is that the organizational power of it allows for people to come together. And even if there is no strict enforcement mechanism in terms of the applicability to the real world versus just within the virtual domain of the country in question, you do get to get through law of large numbers, I think, an effect, even if there is slippage, on the decisions that you make to implement in the real world. And if nothing else, it organizes the conversation and the online discourse around whatever cause it is that has brought you together better. So even if all you're doing is talking online, well, the governance of talking online will be superior because of these dynamic and flexible features. But also, if you want to talk about what you want to do, like a virtual lobby that ultimately plans to affect change in the real world, well, those decisions, even if they're imperfectly enforced, will still have some effect. At least that's the theory. But at the end of the day, we're creating a massive experiment to see what people come up with when they have the flexibility to organize themselves in any way they see fit, and to do so in a permissionless manner. And that's really it. That's the crux of the idea. That was how it traces to the inspiration behind why we started InPeopled in 2012 to begin with. But it takes it into the blockchain and to a minimal 2 smart contract starting point, which with those simple rules can ultimately become as complex and deep as the community decides to take it. And each community's activity is independent of the others. So my mistakes in one community don't spill over and be into another community. And because the starting foundational smart contracts that we minimize to are so basic in nature, there's no real room there for a top-down problem to infiltrate into the countries as they go forward. So their risk is almost solely their own, with a couple, very basic things that we need to be careful about in the foundational contracts. So from there, I want to kind of stop talking. That's the sort of conceptual high-level arc and ambition and where we are now and from where we came from. But what I want to turn it over to is Isno and Argo, and let's start with Isno on maybe bringing that down to earth a little bit and going into a little bit more detail, not full detail, because people can look up the smart contracts themselves, and I think it would take hours, but in as concise a way as you can, is now how would you start translating what I said conceptually into what you and Argo have essentially made a technical reality on a smart contract level?
First of all, wow, the last 14 minutes have been spectacular and a amazing both summary and description of governance, on-chain governance and its relevance, minor mechanics of it, and potential use cases with minor examples that you gave. I think the last 14 minutes is something I have to transcribe to text and read it over and over again just to make it stick in my head. I think it was one of the best descriptions I've ever heard of the process and the motivation behind it and where it's going. So with that, I think anything that I would say would sound nerdy and really not of substance. So thank you for that. Before I say anything else, I'd like to get at least one comment from Argo on what he heard over the last 14 minutes.
I think Ari is way better to explain what his vision is better than I. Yeah, I kind of like his vision. That's one of the reasons I was working with him back then as well. Like it's something that is difficult to those ideas are difficult to translate to an application. Before it was a web application, now we are trying to make it some Web3 application, but yeah, I mean that's the work. It's not easy.
Yeah, it's not easy. It's not easy.
Yeah.
So what this started as was ideas, and we were thinking about how to make it as simple as possible. So I want to emphasize again the simplicity. The simplicity has a certain beauty to it, but it really is just about the most important thing here. Not just because of the nerdiness of being able to understand and program something on the blockchain or use interactions. I think those can be guided by some kind of UI, UX experience, or I'm not an expert for. But I think simplicity comes with a lot of fundamental thinking, which really goes back and reflects to what Aris was talking about at the very beginning. So what have we actually done? Well, we try to put all this simplicity into the actual programmatic smart contract, programmatic logic into a smart contract that it's supposed to sit on chain for any one country. And the simplicity comes in the idea that it's extremely minimal in the sense that the aspects of governance and decision making, that kind of thing, and the laws is simply encapsulated in a single smart contract that has the ability to evolve. And this ability to evolve, I think, is part of what makes it so powerful. So the simplicity is in that it has just the ability to evolve, with the exception of some more fundamental things that are in this, like, let's call it version 1 of governance that we've built. So let's just put a little more of a pragmatic view, more practical on what this looks like. This whole thing was built on Solidity, so it targets something like the EVM, the Ethereum Virtual Machine. Now, full disclosure, I'm not an expert in blockchains, cryptography, or distributed systems. I've read a lot of things, a lot of books, like going back to classic things like Tannenbaum's book about distributed systems. But most of the things that I know about Ethereum, other than from asking people like Argo and reading online and things like that, come from the Antonopoulos book, Mastering Ethereum. It's the same author as Mastering Bitcoin. So Mastering Ethereum is a pretty good book. It is hands-on, and it allows someone to get started very quickly. So that's where most of the knowledge comes from. And a lot of the things that I tried, tested, and with Argo and Aris's help put together, they're simply experimentation. So most of our experimentation took place on this IDE. So it's an interface for programming that Ethereum provides that's called Remix. So if you're looking for a keyword to look up Remix Ethereum. And so it runs in your browser, and it allows you to effectively have a test bed where you can do all of your testing, all of your programming of the Solidity smart contracts, a way to store them by connecting to GitHub and other places or downloading them. But more importantly, it also allows for a way to interact with the blockchain, the actual distributed system that is the global Ethereum through its through Remix itself. So we can deploy from there. We can perform interactions, that kind of thing. And I know we're going to talk later about Etherscan and other stuff. But these keywords, I guess, these keywords are important to just put forward, as long as the disclosure that I'm not an expert in this, but I can do some programming. Okay, so what have we actually done? Well, the very fundamental entity that is a country, as it pertains to living on blockchain, is a single smart contract, the country contract. So once you deploy that on chain, it just sits there and it maintains some references. So when I say references, I mean things like an address on the blockchain. So the actual country is a deployed smart contract. It is accessible via an address on the blockchain. Before we say anything about what addresses do in general, let's just say that when you're interacting with anything on the blockchain, you're effectively submitting a transaction that is absorbed by the distributed system globally, eventually gets processed by a node, and the node uses the data that you provide in your transaction to do specific things and change the global state. Now, all those are, again, a lot of words, very technical. It doesn't really matter. Let's just say that you're performing a transaction, and that means you're interacting with the blockchain, and specifically when you're addressing by that reference the smart contract, you're interacting with it. So when we deploy a smart contract that represents a country, the one thing you can do is interact with it. The other thing you can do with it is simply observe its state, meaning you can observe its data. So you can look at what's there and what this is pointing to and so on. So interacting is what you do when you're actually doing things with the country or for the country, like, for example, making decisions. So when we deploy the smart contract that is the country, it needs to have some governance mechanism for obvious reasons, because we're building some kind of permissionless or permissioned, it can be permissioned depending on how it's built, some kind of governance mechanism for the country. The simplest way we thought of doing this is by simply having a reference inside that smart contract to another smart contract that is the governance mechanism. So already I'm talking about two smart contracts. The first one being the country that's deployed, and the second being the governance smart contract. Just as the country being a smart contract and being able to be interacted with, so does the government smart contract. So whenever there is some decision that needs to be made, the presumption here is that the governance smart contract is going to be the entity that takes care of that logic. So somebody or even the country itself can interact with a smart contract. So smart contracts can interact with each other depending on how they're programmed. But fundamentally, you have a smart contract that is the country that has a reference to another smart contract that is the governance. So the idea here is that any decision that is to be made, let's say we want to change the governance mechanism itself, will happen by simply having interactions made either with the governance contract directly or with the country, which will interact with the governance contract directly. Let me take a step back and speak a little bit about what happens when you actually deploy the thing we've already built, because I think in this way it will be easy to understand how this works, at least at the onset. We've built it in a way such that when somebody deploys a smart contract that is the country, that process also deploys another smart contract that is dictatorial governance. What does that mean? It means that if any decision were to be made, say, to change the governance mechanism, has to go through that second smart contract. Now, who has authority over that smart contract? Let's go back to deploying. So when we deploy the country, somebody has to perform an interaction with the blockchain to deploy that contract, the country contract. That person's address or I should say, an address is provided when that deployment takes place. So suppose that Aris wants to deploy a country and wants to make me the dictator. I will provide him with my payable Ethereum address, one address that I have control over its keys, to be precise. He will take that and use it as an argument, as a piece of data at the time of deploying the country's contract. The deployment itself will take that address, store it internally as the founder for historical purposes, and then when it mints the second contract that is governance, it will take that address and store it inside itself, the second contract, as a reference to a dictator, meaning an address that makes decisions. So if you go and look at what actually happens in the deployment process, you'll find in Solidity language that there is some constructor, meaning some execution takes place when the country contract is deployed, and that does the deployment of the dictatorship and provides the address of who the dictator should be. So that's the start. Now, that just means that the smart contract that is the country is maintaining a reference to a smart contract that has dictatorial structure and has a reference that points to a dictator, some address of presumably a person. It doesn't even have to be a person, but we won't get into that. We'll just say it's a person. So now that you have this mechanism deployed already, the simplest thing you can think of is actually changing that structure itself. What structure am I talking about? I'm talking about the governance structure. Let's not worry about the laws. Let's not worry about what's in there in terms of how the country functions. Let's talk about the governance itself, which is what we're trying to build here. In terms of what sits on chain, there is a country and there is a reference to a governance contract. If we want to change the governance mechanism, the thing that needs to happen is that country's reference has to be changed to a different contract, a new one that we will deploy independently. So this is how this process will work. We will decide on what the new governance mechanism is going to be. We will program it in Solidity as a smart contract, and then we will deploy that on chain completely independently. Then we'll go through some interactions that the actual country contract has that will go through the process of changing the internal reference to point to a new governance contract, the one we just minted. That's all programmed in there, and it uses this self-referential structure where the country contract will go and ask the dictatorship contract, in this case, the original one, whether it allows for that change to take place. And should the dictatorship contract said yes, then the change will take place. The reference inside the country will be updated to a new governance, and then that new governance will be the mechanism that is going to be queried or interacted with the next time anyone desires to change the governance. A similar structure exists for how to add laws. But before we discuss anything about that, I'd like to maybe get some questions. Maybe you require some clarifications of how this works. So I'll just pass the mic to somebody else.
No, I think that was really good. That was very good, Isno. I would say, just to clarify here, and I think you've made it very clear already, but I think it deserves emphasis. It starts as a dictatorship, as you said, through a reference being in a smart contract, and then through the decision logic that was, let's call it T-1, it either passes or fails based on that logic for a new reference, which is the new logic, and that process repeats. Is that correct?
That's correct. Every time you want to change your governance mechanism, that process repeats.
And so basically you go from one change to the next, and the next change is based on the previous change when it comes to the governance logic behind a given country. Now,
that's precisely correct.
My next question is, and I'm sure you were about to go into this, but maybe you can explain what laws are, because I didn't do that when I was speaking, and how laws are incorporated into the country smart contract? And what do we mean by laws?
Okay, that's a great question. And what we mean by laws is something that is as much philosophical as it is practical. And that's where we're going to leave it for a second part of the discussion. Let's first talk about the nerdy side of what a law is inside the country, so that people can understand that there's much simplicity there, and it's very easy to add a law that does something either specific or general and so on. So a law is simply a piece of data. When it comes to the actual country, it is a piece of data that somebody is going to add to the country's storage on chain by performing some interaction with it. That's a very typical process. There's a lot of data storage on chain for a number of things, and it is exactly the same thing. Now, what exactly is a law? At the very, very elementary, fundamental point of view, it's simply an address to some other smart contract. So think about your law as something that can do anything you want that can be done on chain or through some Oracle off chain and so on, but it has to be done through a smart contract. Now, we've already talked about two of them, the country itself and then the governance mechanism. Any law is going to be a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, any number of laws, new smart contracts that have an address on chain. So you will deploy some law on chain, you will take its address, then you will interact with the country, and then that law, if it is accepted to become a law in the country, and there is logic for that in the country itself, it will be instated by being some data inside a list of laws in the country. So that's the first part.
I want to pause there real quick. So that bears emphasis, and I think for people like me who are less technical, you can ignore sort of the data and on-chain references here and simply understand that we are appending and deleting a list of sanctioned smart contracts that become the boundaries, if you will, of the country. So if you want to basically ordain or make official that a particular smart contract / function is a part of the country, you need to add it as a law or delete it as a law if you're getting rid of it from the country using the aforementioned governance logic we've been talking about ad nauseum here. So adding laws is adding smart contracts, which is defining the boundaries of your country, what the country can do, and the logic and interactivity have with the country. That's it. Now, the technical details I'm going to turn back over to Isno here in terms of how it's data storage on chain, etc. But conceptually, that's what's happening here. We are saying we can now do this. This is now part of our country, or this is no longer part of our country. And by doing that, we tie in other logic that we might have. For example, how decisions will be made to modify this functionality using potentially another smart contract we have, which is some other governance logic smart contract specific to that functionality, or we could be reusing governance logic that we are also using for other functions in our country. But sorry, that was a conceptual interjection. I will go turn it back over to you, Isno, to go into more detail here.
Again, that was a great description, especially the first part. There were two parts you talked about, and I'll just parse this for everybody's benefit, at least the way I understand it. The first one is your excellent explanation of what I talked about, which is what exactly is a law, defining boundaries, that kind of thing. A law is a smart contract on chain, and there is a mechanism in the country to add one into a running list. The second part of what you talked about is that this specific smart contract that is a law, as it pertains to its functionality and so on, it can interact with the governance contract or other governance contracts that are specific to that law, like some kind of very intricate thing. And that's fine because Ethereum allows you to do that. The blockchain actually allows you to do that. So there is a branching that happens after any one of these laws is entered into the running list of laws that define the country. And those can perform interactions with completely different entities or the government or the governance mechanism itself that we set. So there are two separate issues here. Returning back to the first one, the law is simply one reference if you think about it. It's just a smart contract. It's just an address. The important thing about it is the word that you used was sanctioned. So sanctioned in what sense? It is a smart, anyone can deploy a smart contract and give you the address. The question is, do you add that law of somebody's smart contract into your country? And the way to do that is to interact with the country itself, which is the first original smart contract, and propose that law. That when the law is proposed, the governance mechanism of the country, that second smart contract, is being queried or interacted with, so that a decision can be made as to whether that law is accepted to be put in the laws of the country or rejected. And so that's the notion of whether a law is sanctioned. But regardless of whether it's sanctioned or not, it can be rejected, that's fine. That law is still a smart contract. The structure we presently have in the country, and I should make a note of this, the data that's stored there is a smart contract address, which it's just so that you can reference the law somehow and interact with. For historical purposes, again, some description, that's like a human readable string so that people can have an idea of what that is, because when you're just looking at numbers, you have to look up some notion. So there's a quick access to that. An address of who authored it, again, to keep track of who did what for historical purposes. And then a status byte. The status byte says whether a law is proposed, it's instated in the country, or it has been deleted. This means that we never actually presently delete any laws, we just make them inactive. That's what happens. They sit on chain, but they're inactive. They don't really do anything. Something may change there. We may actually delete the law altogether, but for the time being, this is the version 1. This is what we built. So a sanction law is a smart contract that the country was queried and interacted with to accept or reject, and it was accepted and it was entered into that list. So that effectively finishes my description of part 1, sanctions, the sanction law and what it is. Part 2, which is what exactly is a law? Well, really, like fundamentally, it's just a smart contract. But smart contracts are there to do things. They are there to perform actions or to provide information or to store data and so on and so forth. So generally speaking, anything can be a law. It can be, I don't know, another country or something like that, or some other governance mechanism. It doesn't really matter from the perspective of what we've built, which is where the simplicity comes in. It's just a smart contract. So what can you do with it? Well, you mentioned a couple of examples, like having a marketplace. A marketplace can be something that starts from one reference to a smart contract and then has a number of smart contracts that interact with each other and so on, that do a number of things. They can also interact with the governance contract if it's appropriate to do so, and they can perform a number of things on their own, but they're sanctioned in the sense that they are into the country. So the people, the entities, the other smart contracts, the wallets, let's say, that will interact with any of these laws, they know that they're interacting with the law of the country by means of observing the blockchain. So it's not exactly in vacuum, and this is exactly where it connects back to the real world and what a country really means. Having something happening on chain is simply like a video game, but the fact that there is meaning behind all of those things, the semantics and the aspect of human behavior and what people are going to do with this country, that comes from outside of the blockchain, the real world, and then all of their mechanics, the decision making, the value transfer, and so on, those happen on chain. I hope that's an adequate description, at least for how vague it should be given the simplicity that we assign. So I can answer more specific questions if you want me to.
No, I think that's really good. For me, that sort of is a good balance now of the concepts here and getting into some of the technical weeds, which of course anybody listening to can jump on the Discord at any time and ask questions about. But I'm going to turn it over to Argo. Argo, maybe anything that you think could be clarified or that you want to expound upon from any of this?
No, well, I think that I wanted to touch on why we are doing this in multiple smart contracts versus just a single one. And the fact is that one of the main issues that we have working with the blockchain is that it's immutable. It cannot be changed. So once you publish a smart contract, that's it. You cannot modify it. You can, just stop using it and mint a new one, and then a new one, and a new one, which is not optimal when you are building a society or are building history as well, because you are working towards building something bigger every time. So the reason why we separate these things like the country and the governance and the laws into multiple contracts is to give you a way so that you can build on top of a very basic base and start making changes. So for example, society is an experiment, and you are not going to build the perfect society at first. It's just impossible. You are going to make mistakes. You are going to want to change things. Any country changes laws because laws change with technology, with time, with people, and that's the idea that we're working with here as well, that if you create a law, you have to be able to change it. The blockchain doesn't allow you to change it. So a good way is just to, separate this into multiple pieces, like Ari mentioned once, like Lego blocks, so that you can put them together. But if you don't like one little piece, you just break it apart and put a new one. So that's the whole idea of this whole reference of one smart contract to another smart contract, is so that you can, the moment that you don't need one, you just set it apart from your country and add a new one, a new piece, a new law, new governance. So yeah, that's the basics.
Yeah, that's perfect. And there are other, that you've already touched on, both of you, technical reasons that make the modularity of encoding this logic trickier on chain than, say, a typical programming language, which necessitates some of this modularity in addition to it just being preferable from a specification point of view as a product. It's also technically necessary on certain levels to be very clear about what can be changed and what can't be changed within these, because the on-chain nature of it does make it a bit tricky, doesn't it? In terms of how things self-reference and dynamically adjust to one another. That's a question for either of you, I guess. Is the technical nature of changing things on chain and how tricky that is.
Yeah,
I agree with that completely. Yeah. Go ahead, Argo. Go ahead.
I think in a normal program development or application development, you just go change the code and publish it again, and that's kind of the easy part, I guess, of development, because you can keep building and keep changing things. But the main aspect of the blockchain, one of its principles is that it cannot be changed. Whatever you put it there, it stays there. So if you made a mistake in your program or smart contract or society, once it's there, you cannot modify it. It's just the nature of it, because it's a global database. So it's just impossible to make changes to that. So there's no way to fix a program or just to change a label or some text. So the idea is that every change you would consider not a change but an upgrade. So you basically are discarding the old thing, and you have to bring a new thing. So you would mint a new contract in this case. Every little change would need a new contract. And that's the idea of why it is modular, because you usually don't want to change everything that you created. You just want to create to change a little piece that doesn't serve you anymore. Let's say a law that you created. I don't know, an aspect where everybody has to talk on Saturdays on Discord. And then you say, well, we got busy and now we cannot talk on Saturday. Now we are going to make the same thing but on Wednesday. On a normal program, you would just schedule the call for Wednesday. In the blockchain, you would need to discard the program that makes the schedule for Saturday and create a new one that schedules things for Wednesday. So that's the idea, that instead of removing everything that you built before, you just change the little part. In this case, in my example, would be the scheduling of the phone call. So that's why we try to simplify this as much as possible into little pieces. In this case, I think it's like the country, the governance, and the laws. Those are the three basic blocks. With the idea that those are the ones that are going to change the most, but at the same time giving you a good base that you cannot change, because if you build something that is like clay, that can be absolutely everything, it's just too difficult to work with.
Yeah, that's a perfect description, Argo. That's exactly right. And for people who are familiar with the blockchain, that may be obvious. But actually, even for people like myself who were pretty familiar, you forget, because the object-oriented nature of programming is so superfluous now that it's taken for granted, really. That, I'm just going to reference with code something else, and it's sort of automatically modular through the virtue of how we use the language. And there are different sort of semi-physical, practical limitations that make this much different, as you described, which, as you also said, and I want to reemphasize, and I said earlier, and I think Isno also said, one of the advantages of minimizing the scope of these foundational 2 smart contracts that are the founding country smart contracts is there's a lot less a sort of trust assumption behind that code, since it's so minimal, that somebody needs to have. So I don't want to call it attack surface, but surface for mistakes and attacks is much, much smaller, because it offloads a lot of the technical and ambitious and difficult aspects of what a country is going to incorporate. It sort of kicks that off into the future with that minimal dictatorial assumption landing point with some basic references, which allows you to change that dictatorial basic assumptive set. So it's not to say that there couldn't be problems with it, but the likelihood is much smaller because the scope is much smaller and because the assumptions are so simple. So yes, I think we've all said that, but it bears repeating. And in the case that, let's say, there were a mistake in this foundational level, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that would only affect countries up to the point until the founding smart contracts were upgraded, and everybody who thereafter were to use the newer versions would not be affected by the older versions. And, well, actually, let me ask that question as a non-technical person myself, to both of you or to either of you. What is, let's say that there is a problem foundationally in this very basic 2 smart contract founding contracts that we've been talking about as the MVP here. What recourse would a country have to be able to change that if it was founded prior to a new version that fixes those issues, if any?
Well, it really depends on what the issue is, but again, it's the good part about using little pieces. Assuming that not all of them are going to be wrong, but just one little piece, is that you eventually can migrate that little piece to the new contract, and all the old pieces remain the same, because again, they cannot be deleted and they don't belong to specific smart contract. So they can just the new smart contract can reference the old laws, for example. So in terms of technical terms, it's just a matter of saying we don't use this contract anymore. Now we use that contract. I guess that in a practical sense is harder to make people to change people's behavior. I guess to teach them to use the new thing and stop using the old thing. But in general, that's the aspect that you can. You don't need to change absolutely everything. You can just change the little pieces that you need to change. And actually, another aspect of that is as well that everybody can use these little pieces. It's not just your country. So if somebody creates a good law, somebody else can make use of that contract, which happens in real life. Like if some country does economics better than other countries, some countries copy those examples. So in this case, it's the same. Like if somebody spends, I don't know, a month working on a new law and mints that contract to be part of his country or their country, then another person can come in and say, well, I like that law, so I'm going to implement that into my own country. So that's the whole aspect of using these building blocks that you can pick and choose.
Yeah, that's a very good point that I forgot to mention. The idea behind the parallel experimentation, it may have been implied, but I didn't say explicitly. The winning ideas can benefit everybody, not just the countries that deploy them, but other countries that take inspiration, as you said, from those successful ideas, and can copy and bring them into their own. So that's really where a lot of the power with scale comes from with this idea and our approach. Okay.
And
Well,
it's also one of the main reasons why we chose to use the blockchain versus just using the normal app, I guess, so that anybody can see what's going on and anybody can implement these new things.
Yeah, and it's fully transparent, open source, etc. Absolutely. All right. Now, I think this is a good point to probably end it, because I think we've gone deep enough and also given enough high level context. But before I let you guys go, is there any last thoughts that you don't think we've covered well enough or didn't cover at all that you would like to say? Okay, I'm going to take from the silent.
I can go first. I really enjoy listening. I really enjoy listening to you two parse away all of this information, and I realize how much I miss in the sense of like not having mentioned, not having crossed my mind to mention that show up when, say, Argo says, hey, you cannot change it, it's immutable, and things like that. Like so many things that I actually miss. So the number one takeaway from a discussion like this is that there's only 3 persons talking here, and so many ideas come online. I think that so much more is possible if this grows to be bigger and there's a bigger discussion about everything that we do. And guess what? If every time you have to implement something, when you have the chaos of too many people talking or too many people having to participate in decisions or making changes and so on, that's precisely what you need governance. So I see it as like, even in this discussion, we can see the need for governance, which is kind of amazing to me to observe. The second is that you guys have very, very good ideas and very nice set of viewpoints. Like your eyes see things in ways that I really enjoy, and I really enjoy how you articulate them and you speak here. They're also quite interesting to see how you approach the matter, including the technical side, but also fundamental and so on. If I were to have some closing thoughts about this, because I want to keep it short and under an hour and so on, I think that there is more to say, because we focused here on the simplicity of founding a country and making it so incredibly simple, such that you can expand it, you can shrink it, you can do so many things, and it's based on this idea. Like, the simplicity comes with the fact that thinking about your country being something that's immutable on chain, and you want to always be able to reference to it, there are references within it that allow it to be flexible. So the actual code that is the smart contract is not changeable. But the fact that you have these references where programmatic aspects can be self-referential, reference to other things, it allows for this thing to grow, starting from something so incredibly simple and robust. And so the side comment for this is, this is exactly why you want a very simple set of rules to be your first country, so that, as Argo said, every time you make a mistake, you have a mechanism for correcting it. Every time you want to perform experimentation, every time you want to expand in any way imaginable, I guess, in any way that is possible through the blockchain, you can. Whereas if everything was mint one time, every mistake you made, you would have to carry it forward, until you decide to completely pivot to a new structure and start from scratch. And that's always very disruptive. So I really like the fact that the simplicity that Aris brought as a fundamental core idea for starting this project was something we have so far upheld. And I really like the structure, and I hope others appreciate the fact that it is so simple, but also so expandable. So in terms of final comments, going forward to future discussions, which I'm sure there will be plenty, how do you expand, and what do these laws, what can they do, what do they do? Well, one of the things we mentioned is we use this blockchain. Well, we certainly are using this blockchain, and there is nothing to stop us from having laws that, for example, use some kind of roll-up or side chain or some app that settles on chain that runs outside of the Ethereum system and is part of the laws. And that means that there will be laws that allow for interactions with oracles or outside things, other software, apps, websites, anything you can actually make that interacts with smart contracts can be interacting with smart contracts that are part of your country and can interact with its governments, and so on and so forth. And that is so incredibly powerful to me. And I think that there will be a lot of things to say about that in the future.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thank you both. Before I let everybody go, there's one important teaser here. This has all been very intellectual, and we've gone from the abstract to the technical details. And please do join us on Discord if you're listening to this. It's Empeopled, EMPEOPLED. But also, we are going to start a country as a community on our Discord, basically to function as an example, where we are going to take this dictatorial foundational starting point that we've been discussing, and we are going to convert it into a democracy together initially, and into whatever else the community ultimately decides. And we will add another smart contract function, probably a treasury, things of that nature, to demonstrate in practice by example as an empeopled country what can be done and how it can be done. So we will bridge all the ideas that you've heard in this conversation into practice by example. And again, that might be the empeopled country, but anybody can start their own and do their own thing at any time, which is key. This is only really to function as an example, and it does not dictate the project in any sense, and therefore all the other countries who decide to build on it, because this project does not affect downstream anything that was created. Each country owns its own future totally. There is no governance from above, is the way that this is structured. So please join us on Discord and help us build either for your country or for our country. Contribute to the ideas and discussion, and thank you anybody who's listening, and to Argo and Isno for taking the time again on a Saturday, and who did all the heavy lifting here. I'm just the one who talks a lot. So thank you, gentlemen. And on that note, I'm going to let everybody go. Have a good Saturday, and we'll talk.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, guys. Ciao, bye.
Bye.